This is the IBJ podcast for the week of March the 2nd, 2020, brought to you by the law firm Krieg DeVault. I'm Mason King. Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. Our guest this week is Jon Laramore, who, if you're not in the legal profession, might not ring a bell, but he has amassed a rare collection of accomplishments over his career. He has worked at the highest levels of law in Indiana. He was chief counsel to two governors, Frank O'Bannon and Joe Kernan. He later was co-leader of the appellate practice at one of Indianapolis's largest law firms, then called Faegre Baker Daniels. And he has argued two cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. He won both times. In fact, he has been interviewed outside the court's chambers by none other than NPR's Nina Totenberg, a distinction that many lawyers would make sure to put on their headstones. But from the beginning of his career, Laramore has been drawn to legal aid, providing attorney services for low-income clients. 5 years ago, he left the big law firm to become executive director of Indiana Legal Services, a not-for-profit with dozens of lawyers in 8 offices around the state. Last year, ILS helped nearly 12,000 low-income clients who were having legal problems with housing or debt collection, bankruptcy, domestic abuse, public benefits, and other issues. In Laramore's 5 years in charge, ILS has made some big strides in helping its client base. In the near future, Laramore expects to be able to expand the firm's capacity to help thousands more clients per year. I sat down with him last week to talk about his latest mission and some of the highlights of his distinguished career. Jon, thanks so much for making time for us today.
Happy to do it.
I want to pick up your story in the middle in 2015. So after working for 10 years as a leader in one of the state's largest law firms, and I'm guessing you're in your early 50s, is that right at that point?
I was in my 50s.
Okay. I assume really at that point you can kick your earnings into overdrive and that home stretch to retirement. You left and you took the top job for the state's largest not-for-profit provider of legal aid services for low-income residents. Why?
Well, I've done a number of things in my career. And at that point at the law firm, I was very happy, but I was ready to do something different. And I had a background in legal aid. That's how I started my legal career. And this position as director of Indiana Legal Services came open, and it seemed like it would be a good fit for me. I got a phone call asking if I would apply, and I chose to go ahead with that. And it's been a wonderful ride. My 5-year anniversary is March 1, so I'm just hitting that point right now, and it's been a great 5 years.
Now, I know that you grew up in Plymouth, Indiana. You went to Plymouth High School. Is that true? Actually, you grew up in Plymouth? Or
I grew up in Plymouth.
Okay.
Born there.
Went to Plymouth High School, then opted to leave the state for higher education. Got a bachelor's degree at Princeton University in politics, then your law degree at Harvard Law School. How did your parents deal with the disappointment in your academic career?
Well, I think that they were happy when, in the 90s, my family and I came back to Indiana. I started my legal career in Massachusetts, where I went to law school. My mom's still around. She's in the Indianapolis area now, and I still have some family here. So it was a good place to come back to and raise a family.
What did your folks do?
My parents together ran a retail business in Plymouth that sold mainly clothing, but over the years had sold a lot of dry goods, you would say. Business started by my great-grandfather. I was the first generation not to go into the business. It's no longer doing business, but lots of people in Plymouth still remember the Bosworth store, and that was our family business.
Why did you not want to go into the family business?
Well, I was interested in pursuing a legal career. I think that was a way for me to give my talents sort of the best outlet. And I think, in retrospect, although I'm sure my parents would have probably liked it if I had come back, it's very hard to make a go of it as a small one-unit store in a small town in Indiana. I don't claim any prescience on that, but I think it would not have necessarily gone in a great direction.
So you graduated from Harvard in '83, which is just really the beginning of the greed is good era on Wall Street. The Reagan administration is in full swing. You must have known a lot of guys and gals at Harvard who were interested in getting out and getting to Wall Street in Washington. But you had an interest in legal aid services. Why was that?
I was able to work in legal aid as a law student, and I found a lot of satisfaction. It's wonderful to work for folks who really need the help that you can give, who needed to maintain a home or needed to maintain the income that they need to take care of their children. So I just found a lot of satisfaction in the work, and I pursued it for the first few years after I got out of law school.
But did that make you an outlier at Harvard? I mean, was everyone mostly interested in?
Most of my class ended up going to big law firms. One of my law school classmates is now the commissioner of baseball. Another one of my law school.
Wait a second, who was that?
Rob Manfred was in my law school class.
Oh, my Lord.
Another one of my, and he, went to a law firm and then went to baseball, which was his client in private law practice. Another of my classmates is Senator Tim Kaine, who has also taken a different view or different way after law school. And his wife, Anne, was also in our law school class, was also in my college class, and Anne became a juvenile court judge. So she has pursued not the Wall Street route either. So there were a lot of us who did some things that were different, but certainly the big majority went to law firms.
Was there kind of an aha moment where you realized, legal aid, this is where I should be?
No, I wouldn't say there was an aha moment, but it was a gradual thing. And certainly by the time I graduated from law school, I knew that's what I wanted to do.
So we'll go back to 2015. You take the job as executive director of Indiana Legal Services. You have more than 100 staff members here in 8 offices across the state. How do the staff members break down in terms of function?
More than half of the people that we have are lawyers. We're actually now closer to 150 than to 100. We have over 75 lawyers, and the rest perform various support roles. We have a large staff of paralegals who can really provide a lot of assistance, both direct assistance to clients and also backing up lawyers. And then we have the usual staff of administration. We have finance people and we have grant writers and that type also. So that's kind of how it breaks out.
I think last year you served as many as 12,000 Hoosiers?
We were just short of 12,000 last year. It's the largest group we've been able to serve in the years I've been here.
Yeah, how has that grown in the 5 years that you've been here so far?
It's grown by about 20%. We were closer to 10,000 when I started, and we've grown a little bit each year. And we've been able to grow the organization. Our budget was around $9 million when I came, and it'll be $12 million this year. So we've been able to grow by bringing in additional funding. We have one big federal funder that's about 60% of our whole budget, and that money has grown. But we've also been able to bring in money from a number of other sources.
Are those also grants or are there donations?
Our donations have grown, but grants are our biggest source. We get grants of all sorts. So just for example, some money came to Indiana through the federal Ryan White program to provide legal services to people with HIV and AIDS. And the Department of Health reached out to us, realizing that we have the same statewide footprint that they needed for this service delivery through their 17 AIDS services organizations around the state. And we got about $150,000 to hire 2 lawyers to do work solely for folks with HIV and AIDS. And it's an underserved population. It's exactly the sort of population that we would like to serve, and it was a great match.
What is, you say, the typical case, or maybe 2 or 3 typical scenarios that you would see from a client?
Probably the largest single number of cases would be individuals who come to us who are survivors of domestic violence who need some sort of protection. It may be a divorce, it may be a protective order, it may be some additional legal services to provide support for children. We also work in the housing area. We defend evictions. We also work with people who are living in substandard housing and need legal help to get to better housing conditions. Those are 2 of our large areas, but there are another half dozen that we do significant amounts of work in. Probably I should be sure to point out that our practice for people who have been incarcerated has really grown in the last 5 years, and that involves helping people expunge convictions, which makes them more employable and eliminates barriers to their getting housing, and also helping people get driver's licenses. Just about everybody who comes out of incarceration has lost their driver's license, and often because there's some unpaid court cost or unpaid other debt. But we can help them get specialized driving privileges which allow them to drive to work, to drive to pick up their kids on a limited basis, and that's another, we do hundreds of those every year.
Has that part of the practice grown intentionally?
Well, it happened because about 5 years ago, the legislature liberalized our expungement statute, and there were lots of people who became eligible for that relief. And we saw those people, they came to us, they wanted our help. We grew that part of our practice. We then made partnerships with organizations in various communities around the state that serve people who have been incarcerated. They're the ones who helped us understand the need for the driver's license practice, which now has outstripped the expungement practice in terms of the numbers of cases that we handle.
Is it true that you do not handle criminal cases, though? This is all civil?
Right. No criminal cases.
How do clients find out about you? You mentioned partnerships, for example, that would direct them. Is that usually the case?
The typical person who comes to us finds us on the internet and calls our statewide intake line. And that's the way most people find lawyers now, is on the internet. So we're no different.
So you need a really robust web presence.
Yes.
Is that something that you've continually been working on, I would assume, over the last 5 years? Or
We have, and I hope to put even more resources into it this year. We're a little bit behind where we should be. There are other statewide websites and actually just sort of national websites that can direct people to us, but we do rely on ours.
I know ILS has a partnership with Eskenazi Health. Is that right? How does that work?
We do. We have partnerships with a number of healthcare providers across the state, about 8 of them. And these medical legal partnerships, we didn't start these, but we are really a national leader because we have so many. And the format of a medical legal partnership is that we embed a lawyer in a healthcare setting, a clinic or a unit of some sort of a healthcare provider, mainly hospitals. We teach the healthcare staff what kinds of legal issues we can work on for their patients that will enhance healthcare outcomes. So then they refer patients to us who have legal needs that affect their health, and we provide solutions. And the proof of the pudding of that process is that with the 8 or so partnerships we have around the state, mostly in central Indiana, but also in northwest Indiana and in the Evansville area, those healthcare providers are paying us this year a total of more than $1 million to provide legal help to their patients because they see it affects patients' outcomes, and that's how they're compensated. It's based on outcomes.
What are some of the services that those patients would need?
You know, it's all the same services that our other clients need. The example I always give about medical legal partnerships is the kid, the 5-year-old who comes into the emergency room with an asthma attack. He gets treated, he goes home, he's back again the next week, he's back again the week after that. It's figured out that there's mold in the house that is causing this. The doctor can't write a prescription to make the mold go away, but you go down the hall to the lawyer, and the lawyer can almost always solve that problem and keep the kid from coming back to the emergency room.
How does a lawyer solve that problem?
Well, when you go to the landlord and show proof of the medical link, which you get from the doctor at your healthcare partner, the landlord is under an obligation to remedy that condition in the housing. If it looks like that's going to take too long, the landlord will often pay the family to relocate to avoid the problem. That's a problem that a lawyer can solve.
So this sounds like a lot of detective work, really.
We do some of it, but a lot of it's done by the healthcare partner as well, because there's usually a social worker involved who figures this out, and there's a team approach to solving problems for people who have those healthcare needs.
Now, I know you mentioned the Ryan White grant. I think there are 4 others that you received recently. I think are going to help serve even more people in the coming years. Can you run through those real quick?
We've just received, in fact, we haven't yet signed the contract, but we've just received a grant from the city of Indianapolis to help with housing conditions and with evictions in Marion County. We've also received a grant from the Indiana Department of Veterans Services to work on housing issues for veterans all across the state. We've received another grant in the medical legal model to work with some freestanding substance abuse disorder clinics to provide legal help for people who are getting services to try to beat their opioid addictions. So those are some of the recent additions, along with the HIV/AIDS grant, that have helped us to grow and that play to our strengths.
Say 2 years from now, how many people do you think you'd be serving annually?
Well, I would hope that in that period of time we would be closing in on 15,000.
Wow, so big jump.
Well, and we, with the growth rate that we've had, and if we can continue to add resources, I think it's a goal that we might be able to meet.
So over the 5 years that you've been here, what 1 or 2 things do you think have been your most significant contributions to ILS?
I feel like we've raised our profile in the community. More people know about us. That helps us when clients are looking, and it also helps us in the fundraising realm. And I think that we have really found ways to use partnerships to provide a range of services to people who need help We're one part of a team in many of those situations.
What have you learned about the effects of poverty in 5 years?
Well, it's interesting. This is not quite the question you asked, but I'll answer a different one first, which is when I came back to legal aid after being away from it for more than 20 years, what I really noticed is this whole issue that you hear about so often about the gap between the top earners and the people at the bottom. It has really grown in that period of time. It's just visible. You can see it more readily.
So the gap is bigger. How is that a detriment to the lower income person?
It just means that there are more people who have needs that we can help them with. The population of folks with civil legal needs at the low end of the income scale is growing. The needs are more serious. They're closer to the edge. It's why eviction is such a horrendous blow to so many families. When you lose your housing, kids have to move to a different school. There's a tremendous amount of disruption. There's a tremendous amount of cost. So it's just life at the bottom is more difficult, in part because of what went by the name of welfare reform in the 1990s. There are not the financial resources from government that people used to fall back on.
I have to bring it up. The current administration is interested in benefit reform as well. Do you have a sense of what might be happening in the next 3 years or so?
Well, it's really hard to say because both Congress and the courts have used the law to prevent some of the more drastic efforts that have been made at cuts. We've been involved in the litigation here in Indiana about work requirements for Medicaid, and most people on Medicaid work already, and most people who don't work have a disability or some other reason that they can't. At this point, that work requirement program has been stopped. The litigation isn't completed yet, so we'll have to see how that goes.
Mm-hmm. Is lack of adequate legal services a contributor to poverty?
I'm not sure I can answer the question that you posed, but here in Indiana at the end of 2018, IU released a study that looked at the legal needs, the civil legal needs of low-income people, and found that the average low-income household has more than one legal need every year. And often they're not perceived as legal needs, something like garnishment of wages, where there are legal limits on garnishment. People may not know that. They may not know that going to a lawyer to have that looked at could be something that would put more money in their pockets every single month, just as one example.
What are the metrics for what you do? How do you evaluate how well your organization is doing its job?
We do collect outcome data of different sorts. So last year, we were able to gain for our clients, on using metrics that I think you would find reasonable, more than $2 million in various kinds of payments. Sometimes it's damages, sometimes it's child support, sometimes it's disability payments. But more important, we were able to avoid well over $5 million in claims against our clients. Occasionally that's through bankruptcy, but more often it's by settling debt claims or getting an adjudication of a child support claim for less than what was asked, those sorts of things. So we do keep track of those financial metrics as well as other metrics. We were able to keep close to 200 families from going homeless last year through our work, and we have other metrics of that sort.
What do you want to improve on next year?
I would like to improve our web presence. I would like to improve the ability or the accessibility of online resources for people who have to go to court without lawyers. I would like to look for ways to use technology so that we can project ourselves more into rural communities that are now costly for us to serve. I would like to work harder on our fundraising so that we can continue to expand our services.
Do you miss being in court every day?
I don't miss it as I thought I might miss it, and I don't particularly. I'm able to keep a hand in a number of the cases that we do here. I'm never in charge, but I can often help, and that's enough. And I find the other parts of the work very satisfying.
Okay, let's take a quick break to hear from our sponsor. This is the IBJ Podcast.
The IBJ Podcast is brought to you by Krieg DeVault, a trusted and dynamic law firm representing a wide variety of local, regional, and national clients. Committed to each other and to every client, Krieg DeVault prides itself on integrity, professionalism, respect, and excellence. Financial institutions, global manufacturers, national healthcare providers, and successful organizations of all sizes and market focus rely on Krieg DeVault to create innovative and successful business solutions. Connect today at www.kriegdevault.com.
Okay, we're back with the IBJ podcast, and we're talking this week with Jon Laramore, Executive Director of Indiana Legal Services. I'm going to fanboy out on you for a second here, because I know that you have argued 2 cases in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. You won 2 cases. You're 2-2. Is that right?
That's
or 2-0?
That is right.
Does that mean that you automatically get into the Lawyer Hall of Fame?
I have, from time to time gotten this or that recognition. Lawyers are extremely good at giving awards of various sorts to each other.
Yes. So are journalists.
Okay. Those were wonderful experiences. And in fact, the second case that I argued in the U.S. Supreme Court was just before I came here. I was at the law firm, but it was a pro bono case. It was an immigration case having to do with this kind of arcane section of the immigration statute. It did affect hundreds of people, and it was wonderful to have success there. We had lots and lots of support. I had a ton of help, so the credit should not all, by any means, come to me.
When was the first one?
First one was when I was in state government, worked in the Indiana Attorney General's office, and it was on a very obscure federal statutory provision having to do with federal court jurisdiction over certain kinds of prison litigation.
How do you prepare for that experience?
The argument is just half an hour, but the preparation starts in the brief writing, which takes weeks and goes through many iterations and editing processes. That's where you lay out your arguments and your thought processes, and you test what works and what doesn't work. Then you sit down with experts, and they do that with your written product. Then when you get ready to do the oral argument, you write down every single question that you can think of that you might get asked, and you sketch out answers. You don't memorize those, but the thought process is what prepares you. And then you go through several practice arguments. I did 2 or 3 practice arguments for each of my U.S. Supreme Court arguments.
Do you have 9 guys up there pretending to be judges when you do a practice argument?
It's usually not 9, but it's usually half a dozen, 5 or 6. Because you do want to simulate the experience, because that's the biggest difference between arguing in the U.S. Supreme Court and other appellate courts is just how many justices there are. And they're in kind of a semicircle, and you're kind of in the middle of it, so you're turning your head. That's what I noticed the first time. You're turning your head back and forth all the time to figure out who's asking you the question. There's only so much preparation you can do. I think you actually have to argue a number of cases before you would ever be comfortable there.
So you weren't comfortable the second time either?
I was not.
Was there ever a moment when you really needed to think on your feet, where they asked you something you did not anticipate?
I have to say no to that, but I will say that in this second argument, the one I did in 2015, we figured out what all the questions might be, and we identified one as being the hardest question I could get asked, and the one where I really wasn't 100% confident in my answer. And it was the first question I got. And it came from Justice Alito, who we thought would not be particularly on our side in this case, and that's how it turned out. And I gave the answer that I prepared, and Justice Kagan stepped in and kind of took over the questioning because she could tell that it was not going well for me. We ended up prevailing in that case 7-2, so it was not one of those 5-4 party line type votes. Neither Justice Alito nor Justice Thomas has much of a record of voting in favor of immigrants in immigration cases, and those were the ones who voted against us.
How do you celebrate winning a Supreme Court case?
Well, it's funny because you win way later, and you're no longer working on that case. You're no longer with all the same people. So you just kind of get together whatever group you can find of people who had something to do with the case, and have a happy conversation, and then send emails or have phone conversations with folks who helped you, who may be in New York City or Minneapolis or wherever, to thank them and to celebrate a little bit.
And then you get a call from reporters who want your take on the decision.
Occasionally. I would say, and this is not to diminish our little time here, but I did get interviewed on the steps of the Supreme Court by Nina Totenberg, which I count probably as actually the highlight of my legal career.
Wow. Did she give you a Nina Totenberg tote bag?
She did not.
You should have asked. Jon, thanks so much for making time for us today.
It's been my pleasure.
My thanks again to Jon Laramore. And folks, before you get on with the rest of your week, I want to draw your attention to a few strong stories in the latest issue of IBJ. Reporter Kurt Christian takes a close look at the cost overruns for Carmel's Hotel Carmichael project and whether they're consistent with rising construction costs industry-wide. You'll recall that the cost of the Carmichael has swelled from the original estimate of $38 million to nearly $60 million now that the project is almost finished. Construction industry experts say material and labor costs have increased by 20% or more in recent years. But the 46% rise in the Carmichael's project cost is definitely outside the norm. Also in this week's issue, Lindsay Erdotti reports that Indiana could have a significant role to play in the Democratic primary process. The heated battle for the nomination suggests that the state could have a contested primary on May the 5th, and that could pack a punch for the state's economy in terms of campaign events and advertising and staffing. And Susan Orr reports that the city of Indianapolis is looking at whether it can secure $72 million in funding for a long-planned Decatur Township Road project. Supporters say it could spark economic activity along one of the county's least developed corridors. You can find all these stories in the latest issue of IBJ, which you, of course, have delivered to your home or office, or online at ibj.com. And remember, to have full and unfettered access to all of IBJ's award-winning business content, just click the subscribe button. Thanks for making time this week for the IBJ podcast, which is edited by Leslie Weidenbenner. I'm Mason King, and we'll be back again next week.